Let's take a look at running Stable Diffusion on a large AWS EC2 instance. We can use the G5 instances available on AWS. They're designed for heavy GPU use. They're pretty popular for machine learning engineers to run large models on. And the reason for that is they have some truly gargantuan instances. We're going to use the G5 48X large instance, which has 8 GPUs, 192 gigs of GPU memory, and 768 gigs of system memory. Before we start the tutorial, I want to provide a disclaimer about AWS. AWS can be pretty risky to run. The instance we're going to be running here costs $16 an hour, and if you accidentally leave that running overnight, you're going to run up a huge bill. You also need to know how to take care of the security on your AWS account, and that's why this is sort of intended more for advanced users who know why they want to run Stable Diffusion on AWS. There's a lot of other free and easier ways to run it. I'll put some of those in the comment or in the description so that you can use one of those ways if that's a little easier for you. But if you do want to run it on EC2, this tutorial will hopefully make it a little quicker to get everything running. So once you're in your AWS console, the first thing we need to do is go into the EC2 console by searching in the service bar and then pulling up the EC2 dashboard. And then from there, we can use the big orange Launch Instance button to spin up a new instance. Once you've loaded that, you'll have a configuration screen for the new instance, and we can give it a name. We're going to call ours Stable Diffusion, just to make things easy to remember. And then we need to choose a Amazon machine image, and this is sort of like the base image for the virtual machine that will be spun up. We're going to choose a deep learning AMI, specifically the PyTorch 1.120 version. And this is a good version just because it comes with all of the tooling that we need to get Stable Diffusion running. And then we need to choose the instance. And like we said, we're going to do a G5 instance because that's one of their best GPU types. And there's a couple different sizes. They're all pretty good, but I'm going to use the largest just because my whole purpose in this is just to play with like the most memory and specifically graphics card memory I can get. So let's choose that. So once we have the AMI and the instance type selected, we can go ahead and finish configuring our EC2 instance. So we need to create a key pair, and the key pair is how we're going to connect to the machine. It's a set of encrypted credentials that we can use with SSH. And then we're also going to restrict the SSH access to our local IP so that other machines can't connect to it. And then finally, we want to go in the network settings, and we want to make sure that AWS assigns a public IP, so we can change auto assign public IP to enable, and that will just give us an IP to connect to once our instance is running. So just give that a quick check over, make sure it all looks good. And when we're feeling good about it, we can go and click the Launch Instance button and spin up our new machine. After launching the instance, we can go back to our instance list, and we should see a new running instance there with the instance type G5 48X large. It will say initializing for a while. It took me a minute or so for the status checks to start returning active. So just give it a minute, and while we wait, we can notice a couple things. You'll see that there's a public IP v4 column in the list that's telling us what our IP is going to be. In our case right now, it's 35.91.8.8. And you can just keep refreshing until the status check returns green. Sometimes you can already connect to it before the status check finishes, but usually you have to wait for it to come back green before you can connect. So eventually you'll hit refresh and the status check will come back 2 out of 2 checks passed with a green check mark. That means we should be good to connect to the instance now. So I'm going to go and copy and paste that IP that we assigned. So find that key pair PEM file that you downloaded, and you want to change the permissions on that to 400. That's because SSH requires it to be protected to use. And then once you do that, you can use it in SSH to connect to the EC2 instance. The user is going to be EC2-user, and then the IP is that private IP that we saw in the dashboard. So once you have that, you can connect, accept the warning message there, and you should get connected to your new instance. So now that we're connected to our EC2 instance, we can start setting up Stable Diffusion. The first thing we need to do is clone the Stable Diffusion repository. So from the GitHub repository, I copy and pasted the repo address, and back in our command line, just run git clone with that address. So that will clone the repository to a directory, and then we can follow the steps in the Stable Diffusion README to set up a conda environment. The conda environment is a sort of self-contained Python environment, and this makes it really easy to install all of the dependencies that Stable Diffusion needs. So this is the first command. We're going to create the environment based on the environment YAML found inside the repository. This command takes a while to run. It took me about 5 minutes or so. So let's just let that run, and we'll be back when it's done to go on to the next step. So eventually that will finish, and it will tell you what to do next. We need to activate the environment we just installed. So I'm going to try running conda activate LDM, but you'll see that we get an error message. It says you need to init the shell for conda. So we'll do that. In this case, we're going to init the bash shell. So we run conda init bash. And then after doing that, you would think you're all ready, but no, you actually need to close and reopen your shell. So if we try to activate it right now, we're going to get an error. So I'm just going to quickly run exit to exit the SSH shell, and then we'll just reconnect to finish activating. And then now we can go back into the Stable Diffusion directory and run the activate command, and that will get us all ready to start using Stable Diffusion. So now we have the instance and we have the Stable Diffusion repository, but we still need to download the weights for Stable Diffusion. And the best way I found to do that is to go to the Stable Diffusion weights page and find the most recent checkpoint. But in order to download that on our instance, we're going to want to do it from the command line. So we're going to copy the curl command from the Chrome DevTools and use that. The reason for this is if you just try to wget it or curl it directly, it'll fail. You need all the headers from the web page. And then you also want to add a dash uppercase L to the end of the options for the curl command. That's going to force it to follow the redirect that they have. And then you just send that into a file with the same name as the file you're downloading with the little arrow. And then this will run pretty quickly because since you're on AWS, you have really fast network connection. So just give it about a minute or so, and then you'll have the weights all downloaded. So weights are finished downloading. You're basically ready to start generating images. So I'm going to go back to the repository and copy their sample command. We're just going to use that. And from the root directory, you just put that back in. You do need to add the checkpoint flag to tell Stable Diffusion where the checkpoint file is. And so we just need to use the same file name that we used when we downloaded the weight. So I'm going to copy that here and put it in. And then once we have that, we should be just about ready to run the command. So I'm just going to kind of look over some of the options real quick, but I think I'm probably just going to use the defaults for now. We'll have plenty of time to experiment in the future once we have our instance up and running. So that all looks good. Let's give it a run. So the first time you run it, it's going to have to download some of the model dependencies from PyTorch. And so it'll take a moment, but it's kind of cool just to watch it do its thing. So after a minute or so, it's going to start generating images and finish pretty quickly. The next time you run it, it'll actually go a lot faster since it doesn't have to initialize everything. But it's now outputted some images for us in the outputs directory, and it tells you right where they are. And so I can change into that directory and see them. But we still need a way to get them off of the instance and onto our computer. So we'll do that next. The method I'm going to use to transfer files from and to the EC2 instance is creating an S3 bucket and then adding a role that we can assign to the EC2 bucket that will let us read and write to the S3 bucket. So we just go to S3, create a bucket called Stable Diffusion. You can name this whatever you want to, but it does need to be a unique name. And then we can ignore the rest of these settings and just create that bucket. Once the bucket's created, we can go to the I am section of AWS. And in there, we can see how to create a role that we can assign to the EC2 instance. So you can select roles. Yeah, just dismiss that pop-up if you get it, and then go to create role. We want to use the AWS service trusted entity type. This means it's a role we're going to assign to an AWS resource. And then they have a common use case checkbox for EC2, which makes it easy to do for EC2 instances. So we pull that out. And then, so this is a little lame. I'm going to just use the Amazon S3 full access policy for this role. You would really want to use the, maybe like create a custom policy that just gives permissions to your specific bucket, but I'm going to delete this right after. So I'm just going to choose S3 full access. And that's going to allow our EC2 instance to read and write and make modifications to all of our buckets in the account. So I'm going to just name that role something I can remember. And just kind of review the permissions we're adding and then create it. Once the role is created, we can go back to EC2 and find our running instance. And then use the actions dropdown in the top and find the security settings. And then use modify IAM role to attach the new role that we just created. And then by attaching this role, it's going to allow us to access S3 from inside of the instance. With that bucket set up and the role applied to the instance, we can now use the AWS CLI tool that's already installed in the instance to sync an S3 bucket to the local file system on the EC2 bucket, on the EC2 instance. And that's really straightforward. You just put the directory locally first and then put the name of the bucket and it will sync it. So that output said that it uploaded all our files. So if we go back to the bucket, we should see everything there, and there it is. That's the contents of the output directory. So now that it's in S3, it's just as simple as downloading the files to our computer so we can view them. You could also configure this bucket to let you just open them here, but I don't have that set up. And you could also mount the bucket to the outputs directory, so you don't need to sync it every time. That's an exercise for another day, I guess. So once we get all the files downloaded, we can pull them up on our computer, and there they are. There's our astronaut riding a horse, just like our prompt said. And these turned out pretty well. Yeah, it's pretty amazing some of the outputs that you can get with Stable Diffusion. I can't wait to experiment with it more once I have this environment set up. So that was cool, but I'm also going to show you how to do the image to image workflow using the setup we just created. So here's a little file I threw together of some mountains or something in Photoshop. And I'm going to show you how we can use the same S3 bucket we created to upload files back to the server too. And of course, there's other ways to do this. Like I could have just used rsync from a server, but I want to have this bucket ready because I'm going to use it to mount directory to eventually. So for now, we're just going to manually use it to transfer files. So I uploaded that input to the bucket root. So now I can run the AWS sync tool in the opposite direction. This time I'm going to sync from the Stable Diffusion bucket to a new directory on the EC2 instance called inputs. So if we run that, it should say it downloads the input.jpg. I can go into that directory and check that it's there. Looks good. All right, so now that the file's there, we can go look at the command for doing the image-to-image script and more or less just copy and paste it. And then go back, put it in. We just need to update that init image argument to be the path to the input.jpg file we just uploaded. So it's inputs/input. And then we still need to set the checkpoint argument as well. So we'll just set that again. And once we have that, we should be ready to run. Once that's done, we can go find our S3 sync command again to just copy all the contents of the outputs directory back to our S3 bucket. So we'll just run that and that'll get us all of our new files. I'll be back over to S3. And so we can go back into S3 and refresh. We'll see all of our outputs come back, and it puts the image-to-image output in a separate subdirectory than the text-to-image. So we can just go and download all the files in there. And here they are. Not quite as good of results as the last one, but it still gets the point across. This is how this could work if you want to do image-to-image experiments. I'll have to do another video when I can make better things. All right, so now that we've seen how to do both text-to-image and image-to-image, I want to just kind of make an important point. This thing's $16 an hour, so we're going to shut it down whenever we're not using it, but we're going to do that with stop. You want to stop the instance, not terminate it. If you terminate it, it's going to kind of destroy all the state that's associated with the image. If you stop it though, the machine's just turned off, you can't connect to it, and you're also not being charged for it. But it means that you can just restart it whenever you want to and just kind of get back to where you were. So once it's stopped, you can go right back into your list of EC2 instances, select it, go to instance state, and click start again. And that'll just spin it right back up. It does take a minute or so to spin back up, but it's totally worth it to save money. And one thing to note is that it is going to create a new public IP address. The IP address changes when you stop it and restart it. So you will have to note that when you try to reconnect with SSH. So I was just copying it here, and I can reuse the same SSH command from before, same key, but new IP. And there it is. We're right back in our instance. We still have Stable Diffusion set up. We still have the weights installed. Even our input and output files are still there. And just to sort of prove that point, we'll run one more prompt to sort of wrap things up. And I hope this was interesting. This was sort of a look at one possible workflow for running Stable Diffusion with heavy hardware. I did use the official Stable Diffusion repository. I know there's a lot of really great forks, like the optimized fork that uses memory a lot more efficiently. And I still have to experiment with all that stuff to kind of figure out the best workflow. And I also kind of want to use this instance to build up my own web UI that I can use to trigger Stable Diffusion so that I can experiment more quickly. But this is the basic setup. This is what you would need to do if you want to have control of your own really powerful GPU instance to run Stable Diffusion. It's really pretty easy, but if you are new to AWS, it could be a little scary, and you should be concerned about it because I've made mistakes with AWS before. You really need to protect your account. You want to set up, you definitely want to have two-factor authentication. You need a good password. If someone else gets into your account, a lot of times people look for open accounts to sort of run crypto mining, and all kinds of things can happen. It's kind of really, with great power comes great responsibility type situation. So again, don't do this unless you're comfortable with AWS. And yeah, be careful, but have fun. Stable Diffusion is one of the most exciting things to play with in computing that's come along in a long time. So I hope you do cool stuff with it. All right. Bye.